Children cannot be left alone. She was the daughter of our neighbor, Aunt Ferhunde, and our houses stood side by side in that old quiet village where every stone seemed to have a story. I knew her when I was just a child, and in the sanctuary of my memories, she has remained a child forever. The years passed for me, and I grew up, but she never had the chance to reach adulthood. She was exactly 1 year younger than me, and because I had started my education early, she was just beginning first grade when I was already in third. Every single morning I would go to her house to pick her up, and we would set off together toward the village school. The school was located about 500 or 600 meters away from our homes, a distance we traveled hand in hand as if we were two parts of a single soul. Because she was of an incredibly frail and delicate build, I would always take her school bag and carry it alongside my own, wanting to shield her from even the smallest burdens. Her mother and her grandfather, Uncle Gedik Mehmet, watched our friendship with great warmth and pleasure. Every time her mother saw us, she would smile and tell me how wonderful it was that I protected her daughter like a true sister. Her grandfather would always beam with a silent, approving smile whenever he caught sight of us. In those golden days, she was my absolute best friend, and we spent nearly every waking moment together. We did not feel the need for other children from the neighborhood. The two of us were perfectly content finding our own games and creating our own little worlds. She was happy in my company, and I found a deep, quiet joy in playing with her. Our village was a place of simple wonders, located right next to the village mosque. Behind the mosque lay the village cemetery, a place that was neither gloomy nor neglected, but rather beautifully tended by the villagers. It was filled with vibrant life, as nearly every grave and every space was adorned with colorful lilies, roses, and carnations. Just like the other children in the village, we would wander into the cemetery together, not out of sadness, but to admire and pick the flowers. There was a massive hackberry tree standing guard in front of the entrance gate, and I would climb high into its branches to reach the small fruits and bring them down for her. The village was blessed with more than 10 different fountains, each fed by a unique spring that sent ice-cold, gushing water into the light of day. Each fountain featured stone troughs designed for animals to drink from, but for us, they were the perfect oceans. We would float paper boats in these troughs, watching them dance on the water. These boats were masterpieces crafted for us by a man the village children called the boatman, whose real name was Uncle Hussein. He was a man of great patience who would sit in the village coffee house and carefully collect empty cigarette packs from the smokers. From these discarded materials, he would fold hundreds of beautiful, intricate boats. Whenever we approached him, he would reach into his pocket and distribute these treasures to us. I remember him vividly, especially his mustache, which had turned a dark brown with a hint of yellow from smoking 3 or 4 packs of cigarettes every single day. Though I eventually learned how to fold paper boats myself when I grew older, I could never replicate the beauty or the magic of the ones he made during my childhood. Our adventures often took us to the heart of the village's industry. We would visit blacksmith Mustafa's grain mill in the village square, or the oil mills owned by the Kafolu and Bayramolu families. We could spend hours settled in a quiet corner, watching the rhythmic dance of the machinery. We watched as wheat and corn were ground into fine flour between massive rotating stones, or as olives were placed in felt sacks and pressed by a heavy, horse-driven press until the rich oil flowed out. At lunchtime, the workers would always welcome us with kindness. They would share slices of bread they had toasted on a brazier and dipped into the freshest olive oil imaginable. We would eat that bread with a legendary appetite, and even now, the memory of that flavor remains the most delicious thing I have ever known. One particular day, as we were playing together in our garden, I decided to make a horse out of a long, sturdy stick. I tied a piece of string to the head of the stick to serve as reins and mounted my wooden steed. I invited her to ride behind me, and together we moved through the garden as if we were riding a magnificent, real horse. We galloped through nearly half of the village streets, our imaginations turning the dusty paths into a grand adventure. Now and then we would stop at the village fountains to let our horse drink the cool water. As she sat behind me, she held tightly onto my sweater and giggled with a pure, infectious joy. She laughed so much that day that her cheeks turned a beautiful shade of pink, and we were both overwhelmed with happiness. It was a perfect afternoon, but looking back, I realized with a heavy heart that it was the very last game we would ever play together. The following morning, I went to her house, as I always did, ready to start our daily journey to school. I knocked on the door and called out her name, but there was a strange, unsettling silence. When I realized that no one was answering, I had no choice but to walk to school alone, a task that felt heavy and wrong without her by my side. On my way home in the afternoon, I stopped by her house again, hoping to find her there, but the house remained empty and quiet. When I reached my own home, I saw my mother, my grandmother, and several neighboring women gathered in the garden by the courtyard oven. They were preparing to bake bread, with wooden troughs full of dough waiting to be used. As I approached, I listened to their hushed, somber conversation and learned the devastating news. They whispered that the poor child had fallen ill the previous night with a dangerously high fever, and her family had rushed her straight to the hospital in Orhan Gazi. They spoke in low, mournful tones about how she had fallen into a coma and that the doctors feared she might not survive. They offered prayers and hoped that God would spare her for her mother's sake, but the air felt thick with a sense of impending loss. The next morning, the world felt cold and different. As I passed by their house once more, I saw her grandfather, Uncle Gedik Mehmet, sitting alone in the garden, crying his heart out with a grief that seemed to break the very air. The garden had been transformed. Bedsheets and ropes had been stretched across the space to create a private, enclosed area. Near the foot of a wall, a fire was crackling under a large black cauldron where water was being brought to a boil. And there, resting quietly next to it, was a small coffin. The sight hit me with the force of a physical blow. It meant that my friend, my constant companion, was truly gone. When I returned from school that afternoon, I could not stay away from the place where we had spent so many happy hours. I went secretly to the cemetery and wandered through the rows of graves in the silent, numbing haze. Eventually, under the shadow of a tall cypress tree, I found what I was looking for: a fresh grave, a tiny mound of earth with newly planted flowers at its head. My friend, my sister, was now lying there in the cold ground. I stood over her and whispered a childish, heartfelt prayer, trying to make sense of a world that could be so cruel. When the evening shadows grew long and darkness began to fall over the village, I finally returned home, my face wet with tears. My heart was consumed by a single agonizing thought. I knew how much she feared the dark and how terrified she would be to be left there all alone. Even now, many years later, the memory of her brings tears to my eyes. I still think of that tiny child, so afraid of being alone, and I find myself wishing with all my heart that she could just come home at night.